Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us for our last midweek roundup for 2021. It's Wednesday, December 29th, and here are three questions we're going to be answering today. First up, why does China want Western knowledge, and how much are they willing to pay for it? Second, how deep is the conflict between Chinese students within the United States? And third, what are U.S. colleges planning for the spring term due to Omicron? We'll take a look at these three questions and more today on the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. First topic, why does China want Western knowledge? Now, this is an interesting debate that goes back many years, certainly not a new topic, but it's been highlighted over the last few weeks as a result of the recent conviction of Harvard University professor, former chair of their chemistry and chemical biology department, Charles Lieber, was convicted on all counts 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago now. He had pled not guilty to 2 counts of filing false tax returns, 2 counts of making false statements, and 2 counts of failing to file reports for a foreign bank account in China. So it was a short deliberation, less than 3 hours, so jury found him guilty on all counts. So what I will point out, this is not a story about, his particular conviction is not a story about illegal property transfer, intellectual property theft, any of that. This is really this guy being a greedy capitalist pig, perhaps, and not filing his taxes and making false statements about the relationship that he had with China, in particular with China's Thousand Talents program. And that might be more commonly known, the commonly known entity or organization that really targeted, sponsored by the Chinese government, Communist Party, and that it was designed to recruit people with knowledge of foreign technology and intellectual property in China, to protect and to enhance, basically, the reputation of Chinese universities and the country as a whole. So that was the goal, has been the goal of the Thousand Talents program. They would hire Western faculty and leaders in industry for these projects, basically. In this case, this professor, Dr. Lieber, was hired by Wuhan University of Technology. And you'll hear in a minute or so just how much he was paid, and one of the reasons why he didn't probably want to file his taxes, because he made a ton of money as a result. He was being paid by Wuhan University of Technology $50,000 a month. He was also paid up to $158,000 in living expenses. He was given more than $1.5 million in grants, according to prosecutors. Now, this was payment, according to the prosecutors, that Lieber agreed to publish articles, organize international conferences, and apply for patents on behalf of this Chinese university, Wuhan University of Technology. So it is probably the highest profile case that's been part of the U.S. government's China initiative, started under the Trump administration in 2018 and is still being carried through prosecutions mainly with the Biden administration. Certainly not getting nearly the press it did as it did under Trump, but that's the mainstream media. But that's this case in particular really points to the impact or the lengths to which this institution went to enhance its own reputation by hiring this prominent professor from one of the top universities in the country to basically help that institution raise its profile in world circles, in academia, in terms of the patents that its professors were to apply for. Again, this case is not about intellectual property theft and that kind of debate that impacted is tied to Confucius Institutes and other articles that we'll get to. But what we see is this is an example, and probably the most above board example. The Thousands Talents program has been around for a while, and many universities have had faculty that have been a part of this. Hopefully they have all reported their income, because it's considerable, and we'll probably have significant taxes to pay on that. And certainly this guy will have a lot of penalties to pay as well as a result. He concealed his income from this Chinese program, and that's why he's convicted. So it wasn't really a political question. It was a question of tax evasion, really, more than anything else, and lying to officials. So this is one layer of that. Why does China want Western knowledge? Because it doesn't have it itself. It's trying to develop it, and will do whatever it takes to get it. Some ways, this is what most people would consider a legitimate way of paying basically well above rate to secure the expertise needed to get that knowledge, and to get their profile raised as an institution and as a country as a whole through all of these Thousand Talents efforts. So that's one part of this Chinese desire for Western knowledge, because it enhances their abilities. They've been playing catch up, they were largely an agricultural nation until the Chinese takeover in 1949, the Communist takeover of China in 1949, and that has led to, certainly in most recent years with the Belt and Road Initiative over the last 15 years, a rapid increase in China's presence on the world stage and in politics and governments and infrastructure and education conversations around the world through its Belt and Road Initiative, through the Thousand Talents program, through their Confucius Institutes, and all of these other things. These are all attempts not only to have parts of their government entity through these other programs in place in certain countries to gain that knowledge, but also it's a reverse, also a way to paint the picture of what the Chinese people are about through the Confucius Institute, and focus on language and other issues, and paint a picture that is more benevolent of how the country treats its people than what perhaps we think of China. And the openness we regard China with related to Uyghur Muslims, to Tiananmen Square being erased from their history books, and other things, human rights violations that we would consider in the West. Those don't factor into, or aren't admitted in any way, shape, or form by Chinese government officials. So the attempts to gain knowledge are certainly ever present, and they are trying to play catch up with technology. And in some areas, they're ahead now as a result of what they've been able to do over the last 10, 15, 20 years. In other areas, they're still playing catch up, and they have put measures in place to help get them over the line and ahead of their competition. And it is a race to them. But they are wise enough where they are planning years in advance, 10, 15, 20 years of advance, and committing the resources necessary to help the country get over the line in the other areas that they're attempting to grow in. So what you see reflected beyond just this case here with Thousand Talents, the other programs we've talked about, Confucius Institutes and their military civil fusion strategy that has come to light with visa policy in the United States. The two other reports I want to mention, one by the Hoover Institution, I should say, and this is a new report that builds on several that they've done over the years, called Eyes Wide Open, Ethical Risks in Research Collaboration with China. And it basically points out a lot of what's been in the press lately about technology theft and intellectual property theft and these kinds of things that we see in the news. We've seen court cases. A lot of professors have gotten arrested. Chinese researchers, Chinese American faculty that have gotten have these ties to some organizations in China that are suspect in U.S. terms. One of which is the Chinese Academy of Sciences Institute of Automation. This is a global leader in education and research on artificial intelligence, biometrics, and neuroscience. this organization in China, but it also works closely with the Chinese Communist Party's public security organ on the development of mass surveillance technologies. And those technologies have been associated with human rights violations against Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. So the report details that and some of the other concerns. Makes some very specific recommendations related to this CASIA group in terms of how the U.S. Should respond, how institutions and organizations should respond to these kinds of requests about and how institutions should conduct themselves in relation to organizations like this that it may enter into agreements with or not. So there's some, and hope the recommendations are to develop and uphold ethical standards and protect human rights. These are the things that this institution, Hoover Institution's report, certainly indicates U.S. as a government and institutions and organizations, including universities, should make a part of their decision-making process about who they interact with and what standards they set. I know I'm working with one institution right now that's internationalizing for the first time, and we've been having the conversation for several weeks about what do we need to do to properly vet our future clients, our future partners that we work with overseas. We've talked about what that looks like if you're vetting for when it comes to national security and terrorism. There's State Department has a list. So if any signatories of a partner organization, university, agent are connected with organization and that's on a State Department watch list for terrorists, that's obviously not a group that you want to engage in a formal relationship with, because that's a potential threat to national security. And now this organization, Hoover Institution, in its report is saying that the federal agencies should deny or remove funding for research projects that involve collaboration with these dodgy, in our terms, dodgy institutes or dodgy standards in human rights and that type of thing. So we'll see if these recommendations get taken up. These are just some things that can impact if an institution is thinking about this holistically in terms of how do we set standards for who we get involved with as an institution outside the United States. So certainly a good report if you're looking for that kind of information. Another report, a much more detailed one from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, FDD. It's entitled "The Middle Kingdom Meets Higher Education: How U.S. Universities Support China's Military-Industrial Complex." Now, when I think of military-industrial complex, I was a history poli-sci major in college. I think of the 1950s and Dwight Eisenhower and post-World War II, developing a Cold War mentality and how important the military was in terms of defending the country, but also serving as a buffer to communist ideology and that type of thing that was threatening to upend who we were as a country. So in U.S. terms, we kind of get what that looks like. But for China, the military-industrial complex, and this is where we get into the military-civil fusion strategy that received prominence in the last couple of years of the Trump administration, where institutions in China, universities in China were on a list that the U.S. government maintained. No one really ever saw what that list was, but those were institutions that were connected with this military-civil fusion that were particularly designated to obtain technology and intellectual property through any means necessary. So that's a highlight of this FDD report that talks about what the nature of these organizations are and what that looks like in terms of in the United States. They highlight in particular the Confucius Institutes. For those that aren't aware, at one point there were 113 Confucius Institutes in 2018. As of 2021, at the end of 2021, only 34 of those remain open. So 2/3 have closed in the last 3 years. It talks about why those organizations, why the Confucius Institutes became problematic, because the institutions really didn't have exert enough control over the content of those programs that were meant to be Chinese culture and language promotion, but ended up being kind of means to ends to basically support the Chinese government's attempts to obtain technology. So those are a lot of negatives associated with that. But it goes through all of the different programs, all of the different universities that had these Confucius Institutes and why they changed. It talks about the specific Chinese universities that are part of this military civil fusion strategy. Gives some examples of what that looks like. So really interesting ways to talk about how universities have conducted themselves, Chinese universities in partnerships with these Confucius Institutes to extend their influence. So it's a very detailed report, huge report. So one that perhaps you want to have on hand if you're looking, if your institution is looking to at Chinese university partnerships and what that might look like, and perhaps some not ones to avoid, but certainly questions you need to be asking yourself as institutions that before you go too far down the lane with any particular institutional partner. Okay, that's enough on that first question. A topic, obviously, that we will come back to many times, I'm sure, in the years to come. But one that certainly deserved its attention because of the three very different kind of stories we just alluded to. But the second question of the day is related, and it's a U.S.-China focused issue. And it asks, how deep is the conflict between Chinese students in the United States? Now, we all know that and have had experiences working with Chinese students over the years on our campuses that there are going to be some students that really embrace the American way of life, that maybe some that become actually fairly anti-China in terms of Chinese Communist Party ideology, in terms of what's allowed to talk about. They become very vocal about that, and there's a case that we'll talk about that happened with Chinese students at Purdue. I will mention that in a minute. But you also have students who come over from China as undergraduates, and maybe they're on joint degree programs, and they come to campuses that have host family programs and get very ingrained in American culture, and really their eyes get wide open, eyes become opened to perhaps some things about their home country that they didn't know about because they were never taught about them. And certainly there are things like what's happening with Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang province, what happened with Tiananmen Square that aren't even mentioned in Chinese history textbooks. So there are those students that become Christians that come as Chinese, where it's really not encouraged. There are 140 million Chinese Christians back in China right now, but that's not always even allowed. That most churches are all underground there. So that's a reality that some students see when they come. Others that become leaders of maybe the Chinese Student Association on campus tend to be more ones that are towing the party line, so to speak, and in terms of what they'll talk about, what topics can be covered and not, their role on campus, not just for international days or international weeks where they have their booths and share their culture and through fashion and all the various topics that we usually cover, food obviously. But we've seen in recent years, particularly when it's come to Confucius Institutes, when it's come to discussions on campus that are considered verboten in terms of Chinese government topics, inviting the Dalai Lama to campus always brings protests from Chinese student associations, talks about Tiananmen Square, talks about Uyghur Muslims and the human rights abuses committed against them. Those are never discussed or never tolerated by certain groups of Chinese students. Now, what has happened at Purdue University is we have two takes that I'll be dropping the links to stories in the comments section on the Facebook page for this event. that one from the Global Times, which is a mouthpiece for the Chinese Communist Party based in China, funded by the Chinese government, that talks about this Purdue University student, PhD student, who was openly critical in some remarks he made about China and related to topics on Hong Kong, on Taiwan, basically aligning with democratic forces in Hong Kong, or that were maybe seen as secessionist by the Chinese government. Also, the student, PhD student, considered Taiwan as its own sovereign state, not just another territory or province of mainland China. Which the Chinese government obviously certainly believes, and that's a topic that goes back to the foundation of the People's Republic of China in 1949 when the Communist Party took over. China China has never admitted that Taiwan is a separate state. It always has considered it since 1949 a province of China that is maybe like a Hong Kong that had been independent and is just has its own way of government and running its economy. They want it back. They're doing everything they can to get it back through military expansion into the South China Sea and other means to make it less likely that it will ever be a fully independent state. But this PhD student, getting back to the point here, he was Chinese students at the campus that did not agree and were Chinese students that would toe the party line in terms of what the Chinese government said related to Taiwan, Hong Kong, and other topics that aren't even mentioned in this Global Times article related to Uyghur Muslims, related to Tiananmen Square. Not even mentioned in the Global Times article, were prominent in what the student was espousing that were anti-Chinese government. These Chinese students that are in the article, Global Times article, they're given pseudonyms because they are trying to protect their own identity because they know they're going to be targeted by Purdue for persecution or prosecution for their misdeeds. That at our school, this is the leader, one of the leaders of this movement, a senior student majoring in communications. At our school, Chinese students are outraged to hear Kong slander. Some of our compatriots were seeking legitimate ways to expose his hypocrisy, but not to attack him out of line. So this is this senior student who was saying that. She says, the Purdue president came to believe only listening to what the media said that Kong had been persecuted. And even he slapped all Chinese students with a collusion with foreign governments in repression charge. And we'll talk about that when we get to the other article from Inside Higher Ed. So we had a representative of the Chinese embassy in D.C. Had said that Purdue University's alleged allegations against its Chinese students are unfounded, and such allegations pose a threat to the reputation and safety of the Chinese student community. The student who was being persecuted by these pro-China students has been sharing his email around in various interviews, waiting for, and this is the articles, waiting for more anti-Chinese activists to extend an olive branch to him. And here's a great there's some amazing lines in this article. You have to read it just to get a perspective and really a sense of what we're dealing with here, and in terms of the position of the Chinese government. Experts and observers reached by the Global Times said that Kong's words and actions must have been influenced by the environment where he studied and lived in the United States. Currently, the U.S. is seeking every possible way to contain China. Well, in a lot of ways that's true because it's overextended itself in a number of areas, with more Chinese students becoming targets of influence to oppose China. These people are, and here's a great one from the professor at the Institute of International Relations in China Foreign Affairs University, Li Heidong. He Professor Haydong or Lee said, these people are the defective products of American education system. Their being able to have an audience shows a sick social environment in the United States. And back to the student representative who's been leading the charge against this PhD candidate. People with ulterior motives are everywhere in the United States, noting that on campus, many anti-Chinese clubs have set up China-related topics with ulterior motives to brainwash students and recruit like-minded people. Dear, this is free expression on campus. Your government does not allow that. Anything that's, as you know, and you didn't mention it in your quotes, because it's sacrilege to say that Tiananmen Square actually happened. It's sacrilege to say that the Uyghur Muslims are being persecuted in Xinjiang province or re-educated in concentration camps, that there's been genocide happening there. There are companies now in the United States that will not buy products that are coming from that province of China because of the abuses that have been documented. And the Chinese government is never going to admit that. They're never going to admit to Tiananmen Square. It's been stricken from the history books. Never happened. You keep on believing the same lines over and over again. As students, if you've never been taught otherwise, you're going to have some students are going to have a very different reaction when they hear about this for the first time when they come to the West and are educated about that, what actually happened in their countries. So that's the dilemma that you face, and it's one that you seem to see on campus. There are divisions in those Chinese students that are willing to speak up because they've seen both sides and they've seen what's happened and actually can talk about the issues that are being swept under the carpet by the Chinese government. And we, in the United States, we have a tradition and on our campuses of academic freedom, freedom of expression, freedom of thought. And these Chinese students that are coming here and are towing the party line and are being very defensive of the Chinese government. They have a right to defend their home country and what their country stands for, but they do not have a right, as the case is pointing out here with this Purdue student, to openly attack him, threaten him to report him to the Chinese embassy, and those types of things. And that's obviously happened. They know about the student now. And what that means for his family back in China. We've heard other stories about how other students that have spoken out, their families back in China have been persecuted as a result, or denied opportunities, or thrown in jail, whatever the case may be. That is fact. It happens. And in this case, who knows what's going to happen with this student's family back in China. There are political dissidents, journalists, professors who've gone against the grain in China have ended up in custody and behind bars on trumped-up charges or charges of promoting ideas that are against the government. And that is something that in the United States, that culture does not exist. That culture is not tolerated here, thankfully. And this is something that you see in the Inside Higher Ed article that talks about the same situation, that President Mitch Daniels at Purdue had he's talking about what happened to his family back in China. He specifically mentions Tiananmen Square, the students, the hero students there that were killed. That was specifically mentioned. He mentioned the Uyghurs. That's never mentioned in the Chinese Mouthpiece article we talked about from Global Times. That his parents in China received a visit from officers of the Ministry of State Security, China's spy agency, warning him about his U.S.-based activism. So his parents have been threatened because of what he said here in the United States, and that's. They are threatened, the student groups are threatened to report him to the Chinese embassy and state security agency. That's already happened, obviously. So this is unacceptable and unwelcome on Purdue's campus. And that's quotes from President Daniels. That if the university finds out who these students are who are threatening him, who threaten to report him to a foreign entity for exercising freedom of speech or belief, will be subject to significant sanction. So he talks about, Daniels talks about Purdue's history with international students, and had 200 new Chinese students enroll there last fall, which frankly isn't a lot compared to some of their other Big Ten rivals, particularly at an engineering school where Chinese students generally are very STEM focused, and will enroll in engineering classes, but that's different at Purdue. That's really interesting to see the counterpoint with this article and the Global Times article. So if you want to get more into it, definitely subscribe to the newsletter. Go to our archive page of all the newsletters editions. It's at smieconsulting.org/subscribe. And again, if you're listening on repeat on Facebook or Twitter or Facebook or YouTube, you can get the edition. If you're not already subscribed to the newsletter, you can get all the links to the articles that we're discussing here in that newsletter archive if you're not watching live on Facebook. So that's what's happening with regard to that deep conflict that's occurring between Chinese student groups on campus in the United States. Final question: what are U.S. colleges planning for the spring due to Omicron? I want to say it's like we're going back in time. It's March 2020 again, and cases are exploding around the college campuses around the country. And you see groups like Cornell University at the end of the fall term there, 900 cases, big headlines all over the country. They shut down, went online. You've got a lot of institutions now that are looking to go online for the beginning of the spring term. We know that there are more than a dozen residential colleges that have announced in recent days, this from a Chronicle of Higher Ed article, that they will teach online when students return in January. Some are saying it's a week, some are saying it's 2 weeks, some are saying it's indefinite. Some on college campuses have sent students home early. Many of these that are going online again in the spring are ones that already had vaccine mandates in place. So the cases, one would assume, based on what we know about Omicron, that it's more contagious, but it's less damaging and less severe condition than Delta or the earlier variants. So what we're seeing here is that it's a little bit odd that with college students being the kind of the most resilient, other than kids, to COVID. There are obviously exceptions, and for those students that are in that exception pool, they need to be accommodated clearly and allowed different access to the same materials if they're not able to go in person, or they should have that online ability. You've seen college campuses also who had vaccine mandates in the fall now are looking at putting booster mandates in place. A number of colleges, probably a dozen campuses, have already done that for the spring. So we're seeing that's happening quite a bit as well. So we'll see what happens in the coming weeks and months, but it does look like we're going back in time. Even though we thought we were maybe coming out of the pandemic last fall, the reality is it's going to be with us for a while. It might be a regular part of college life, of everyday life in the United States, frankly, and around the world, with these different variants that we're experiencing. But one thing is for certain: immigration regulations need to catch up with this situation. We've had this kind of 2-year kind of exception that has allowed current students to be on campus or in the United States enrolled in F1 student status, but being able to take more than one college class online, or all of them online. So that is something that we're going to see more of, I think, and a need for more flexible immigration regulations that were written in the 80s that don't accommodate for, or early 90s, that don't really accommodate for the kinds of situations we find ourselves in. So hopefully we'll get around to that. But that's all we have for this week's, our last edition of 2021 for the Midweek Roundup. And we look forward to you joining us next Wednesday, January 4th, for our first edition of 2022. And until next time, Happy New Year.